My name is Jim, and I've spent a lot of time on the road as a truck driver. Ever since I completed trucking school, I've been driving long distances every day. My days often stretch for hours behind the wheel, and even though the job comes with some benefits, the pay has never been great. Sure, it was enough to support my wife and me, but the stress was nearly unbearable. Being in a truck for long periods each day means that sacrifices are inevitable. I often missed out on family events, birthdays, holidays, and other important gatherings. It didn't feel good to be away from home for so long, especially when my family needed me. The country has an urgent need for truck drivers to meet the growing demand, which only made things worse. I would often drive for around 12 hours a day, and the rules meant that I couldn't stop for any reason until I reached my destination. The hours were long, and the time with my family was short. The lifestyle became a heavy burden. But despite all the struggles, I kept going, hoping that things would improve, or at least that I could keep my family financially stable. One night I was on my usual route, driving to a warehouse complex to deliver products for major retailers like Target and Best Buy. I was in a rural part of Wisconsin, somewhere far off from the busy highways. It was a long, empty road that seemed to stretch on forever. It was about 6 a.m., and I was sipping my coffee to keep myself awake. As a full-time trucker, caffeine was my best friend. Without it, staying alert on the road was nearly impossible. I was driving down this desolate road, trying to stay focused, when something big caught my attention. It was moving across the road in front of my headlights. I immediately shouted an expletive, slamming on the brakes and coming to a complete stop. I thought I had either hit a person or maybe even a bear. My heart raced as I tried to process what had just happened. At first I thought it was a person, but then I realized whatever it was had to be massive. It was 9 feet tall, had a bulky body, and moved in a way that didn't seem normal. I grabbed my gun just in case and stepped out of the truck to investigate. I walked toward where I had seen the figure cross the road, expecting to find either someone in trouble or some kind of animal. But when I looked around, there was nothing. No sign of anyone walking on the road, no roadkill, nothing at all. The only thing I could find were faint tire marks from where I had braked too hard. It was all eerily quiet. I called out, wondering if anyone else was nearby, but the only responses I heard were the sound of the wind and my truck's engine. No one answered. I got back in the truck and continued on my route, but I couldn't shake the image of what I had seen. It was on my mind all day, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Later that same day, I called up one of my fellow truckers to tell him about the strange experience. He told me that he had gone through similar things while on the road. He suggested that it was probably just a hallucination due to the exhaustion. I wasn't so sure though. Thankfully, I had a camera mounted inside my truck, and it had captured a brief moment of whatever I had seen. The quality wasn't great, but it was enough to show something odd. You can see in the photo that the camera wasn't clear, likely because of condensation on the windshield, but it was definitely something strange. Looking at the photo now, I can't help but wonder what it was. The road I was on was surrounded by a forest on both sides, so it's possible it was some kind of animal. But what kind of animal is 9 feet tall and walks on 2 legs? I don't know if it was a person, some kind of animal, or something else entirely. All I know is that I wasn't imagining it. I saw something, and it felt real, even though I can't explain it. The more I think about it, the more questions I have. I still don't know what I encountered that night. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or maybe there's something out there, something bigger than what we understand. I've heard stories about creatures like Bigfoot, but I never thought I'd experience something like that for myself. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot, but I'm not sure what else it could have been. Either way, I can't forget what I saw. For anyone who hasn't experienced long-haul trucking, it's hard to explain how isolating it can feel. You spend so many hours alone, and the road becomes your only companion. The quiet stretches of highway, the never-ending hours behind the wheel, and the monotony of the journey can start to play tricks on your mind. The job is physically demanding, mentally exhausting, and emotionally draining. There's a certain loneliness that comes with it, especially when you miss out on important moments with your family. Job is the constant pressure. Trucking companies are under a lot of pressure to meet deadlines, and the demand for goods is always growing. If you're late, or if something goes wrong on the road, there are consequences. It's a tough job, and it can be dangerous. It takes a toll on your health, your relationships, and your mental state. Some days it feels like there's no end in sight, like you're just going through the motions, driving from one place to the next without any real break or relief. But then there are moments like the one I experienced in Wisconsin. Moments that make you question everything. When you're alone on the road, driving through unfamiliar places, your mind starts to wander. You wonder what's out there, in the dark corners of the world, just beyond the reach of your headlights. For me, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion that made the job difficult. It was the psychological toll, the isolation, the long hours, the constant pressure to keep going. And then there's the fear that comes with being on the road at night. When you're in the middle of nowhere, it's easy to imagine all sorts of things lurking in the shadows. Maybe that's why I was so shaken up by what I saw that night. Maybe it was a combination of the fatigue, the isolation, and the strange feeling that there's something out there that we don't understand. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something is out there, something that we can't explain. It's easy to dismiss what I saw as a hallucination or a trick of the mind, but deep down, I know it wasn't. There was something on that road, something huge and powerful, something that didn't fit the usual patterns of the world around us. Maybe I'll never know what it was, but it's something I'll never forget. Driving down that long, empty road in Wisconsin, I felt more alone than ever. But now, every time I get behind the wheel, I wonder what else might be out there. Maybe there are things we can't see, things that exist just beyond our understanding. Maybe the road is full of mysteries, waiting to be discovered. Since that night, I've been thinking about it more and more. The road feels different now, like it's holding secrets I can't quite understand. It's a strange feeling, knowing that you've seen something so unusual, but not having any real way to explain it. Each time I pass through that rural stretch of Wisconsin, my mind races. I keep thinking, what if I see it again? Part of me hopes I don't, but another part of me is curious about what I actually saw and what's out there in the shadows. I've talked to other truckers since then, hoping to find someone who might have had a similar experience. Some of them brush it off, saying it was just the fatigue messing with my mind. Others, though, have shared their own strange stories, things they've seen on long drives in the middle of nowhere. One trucker told me he'd seen something like what I described, a tall, dark figure walking across the road late at night. He said he didn't know what it was, but he had a bad feeling about it, just like I did. I've heard all sorts of rumors over the years. Stories of strange creatures, mysterious happenings on isolated roads, and sightings of things that defy explanation. Some people talk about Bigfoot, others mention cryptids, while some just think it's a case of overactive imaginations. But the more I hear these stories, the more I wonder if there might be something to them. Could it be that there are things out there we don't fully understand? It's not just one person seeing strange things, it's a lot of us, in different places, on different routes, and at different times. That alone makes me question what's really out there. There's another part of me, though, that's a little scared to dig too deep into these stories. What if there's something I'm not supposed to know? What if I learn something that changes everything? It's a weird feeling, part curiosity, part fear, part confusion. When you're on the road, all you have is your thoughts and the constant hum of the engine. Your mind starts to wander, and in those quiet moments, it's easy to imagine things. Maybe that's all it was, my mind playing tricks on me. But I don't think that's what happened. What makes it even harder to ignore is the fact that I wasn't the only one who saw something strange. I know there's no way of truly proving what I saw, but the fact that I'm not alone in having these kinds of experiences means something. And for all the stories I've heard, it's hard to just dismiss them as coincidences. I keep asking myself, could it have been something real, something we don't fully understand? As a trucker, you learn to trust your instincts. There are times when you feel something isn't right, when you get that gut feeling that something is wrong, and you act on it. I trust those instincts every time I drive, especially when I'm out on long, lonely roads. That night, my instincts told me something was wrong. Something was out there, something I couldn't explain. It's not just about the physical danger of being on the road, it's about the feeling that something beyond our understanding is lurking just outside the headlights. What really haunts me is that I'll never truly know what I saw. The uncertainty is the hardest part. It's like I'm caught between two worlds, one where everything is logical, and one where the unknown exists, waiting just beyond what we can see or understand. And every time I hit the road again, that uncertainty follows me. I've even thought about going back to that spot in Wisconsin to see if I can find any clues or maybe even catch another glimpse of whatever it was. But deep down, I'm not sure I want to. There's something unsettling about that place now. It's hard to explain, but it feels different, like it's holding on to something I'm not ready to face. I've driven that stretch of highway countless times before, but now it feels like a place where the rules of reality don't quite apply. Something about it has changed for me, and I'm not sure if I want to discover what's hiding in the dark. I can't help but think about how many other truckers are out there, driving in the same isolation, wondering if they've seen something similar or if they ever will. We all share the same roads, the same struggles, the same fatigue, and sometimes we share the same strange experiences. The more I think about it, the more I realize that we're all part of a larger world, one that we don't fully understand. Maybe we're not meant to understand it all. Maybe the unknown is just something we have to live with. One thing I know for sure is that whatever I saw that night was real to me. It wasn't a figment of my imagination or a hallucination. It was there, in front of me, and it left me with more questions than answers. I don't know if I'll ever get the answers I'm looking for, but I do know this: there's something out there, something beyond what we can explain. And as long as I keep driving down these long roads, I'll be wondering what else is out there, waiting in the shadow. The more time I spend on the road, the more these thoughts linger in my mind. It's strange, the way something like that can stay with you. When you're out there alone, there's so much time to think. The endless miles of highway, the hum of the engine, and the quiet stretch of the night can lead you into deep reflection. For a trucker, that's often where you have your most honest conversations, both with yourself and with the world around you. That night in Wisconsin still feels fresh, even as months pass. I often wonder if I was just imagining things. Maybe it was the exhaustion getting to me. But then, I remember the details, the size of whatever it was, the way it moved across the road like it wasn't a part of the world I knew. That's what makes it harder to shake off. The sensation that what I saw didn't belong, like it wasn't meant to be in my world, and that thought has stayed with me. Like mine before, sure, but hearing something and experiencing it are two different things. I remember reading about strange sightings on forums and listening to truckers share their experiences, but never once did I think I'd be one of those who would have a story to tell. Some truckers talk about the things they've seen late at night, isolated stretches of highway where they felt like they weren't alone, or even sightings of strange figures or lights. It's not something we usually talk about openly. There's a certain stigma, a sense of disbelief that comes with these kinds of stories. But the more I talk to fellow truckers, the more I realize that I'm not alone in having strange encounters. One of the drivers I spoke to told me about a time he swore he saw a huge shadow move across the road in the dead of night. He described it as being almost human in shape, but something about it just didn't feel right. When I told him my story, he didn't hesitate. "You're not crazy, man. I've seen something like that too," he said. "Sometimes the road has a way of making you question things. It's like there's something out there, just beyond what we can see." That was the first time I'd heard someone else openly admit to seeing something strange on the road. It made me feel like I wasn't just imagining things, but it also opened up a floodgate of questions. What else have truckers seen on these long stretches? What else might be out there, just waiting for someone to notice? I think a big part of what makes truck driving such a unique job is the solitude. When you're out there alone on the road, you can't help but feel like the world is yours to discover. It's a strange balance between the mundane and the extraordinary. You're driving through landscapes that seem endless, through towns and cities you'll never visit again, and each time you pass through, it's like you're just passing by the fringes of life itself. But then there are moments like the one I had in Wisconsin, when the road feels less like a route and more like a path to something unknown. After hearing about my fellow truckers' encounter, I started to wonder if there was something more to this. What if this was a shared experience, something larger than just one person's imagination or exhaustion? What if these things were part of the vast, mysterious world we travel through, hidden just beyond our normal understanding? There are moments when the road feels almost magical in a way, like you're driving through a place that doesn't quite fit with reality. The eerie quiet of the night, the way the stars shine in the distance, and the sensation of being on a journey to somewhere you don't quite understand. That's the thing about being a trucker. You're in constant motion, but the places you pass through often seem suspended in time. And sometimes, that sense of suspension extends to the strange things you encounter. One night, after telling my story to a couple of other drivers, I started to think about how many people are out there on the roads, driving in the same isolation, and how many of them might be seeing strange things too. Some of the truckers I spoke with said they'd heard of phantom hitchhikers, people who appeared out of nowhere on lonely stretches of road and then disappeared just as mysteriously. Others talked about strange lights in the sky, lights that seem to follow them or flash in the distance. It makes you wonder, how many of these things are connected? Are they just the product of our minds, playing tricks on us after long hours of driving? Or is there something more to them, something hidden in the vast emptiness of the night? I've also thought a lot about the idea of the road itself. It's such a powerful symbol for truckers. It's both our livelihood and our isolation, our freedom and our burden. In a way, the road is like a living thing, constantly changing and shifting. Some days the road is calm and predictable. Other times it feels unpredictable, like it has a mind of its own. I can't help but wonder if the road might be hiding things we're not meant to understand or see. Maybe there's more to the world than what we can see with our eyes, and the road is just the place where the unknown lingers. As time has passed, I've become more reflective about the whole experience. I still think about that night in Wisconsin, and I still have no real explanation for what I saw. But there's a part of me that's okay with not knowing. Maybe there are some things we're just not meant to fully understand. Maybe the world is full of mysteries that we're not supposed to solve. And maybe that's part of what makes the journey so fascinating. Sometimes when I'm out on the road, I think back to that moment when I slammed on the brakes and saw something massive cross the road. It wasn't just the creature I saw, it was the feeling it left behind. The feeling that something out there, something big and mysterious, was watching. It made me realize that no matter how much we drive, no matter how much we think we know the road, there's always something more waiting, just out of sight. I've been driving trucks for a long time now, but I don't think I'll ever stop wondering what I saw that night. The mystery of it lingers in my mind. Maybe it's a reminder that no matter how much we travel, we're always just passing through, never really understanding everything the world has to offer. But maybe that's okay. Maybe the road is meant to be full of questions, and as long as I keep driving, I'll keep wondering what else is out there, hidden just beyond the headlights. My name is Tom, and this is a story that happened to me just last month. For some context, I work as a full-time trucker in Montana. I'm currently 50 years old, and I've been driving trucks for about 30 years, delivering goods up and down the country. Over the years, I've been through nearly every state along the West Coast, flown overseas, and even driven through the states along the East Coast. For those who may not know, flyover states are the ones often passed over by intercontinental flights. They are places like Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Wyoming, and so on. These states aren't as popular as other destinations, but they have a certain charm and are often mentioned in songs, like one by the country singer Jason Aldean, whose voice I happen to admire. Anyway, the incident I'm about to tell you about happened on November 21st of this year, and it shook me to my core. To this day, I can't shake the memory of it. It was without a doubt the strangest moment of my life. I'm still trying to make sense of it, but I'll tell you the story as it happened. It was the middle of the evening, and I was following my usual route down a long highway in Ohio. I was driving a semi, so naturally, the truck consumes a lot of fuel. And as I was making my way along the highway, I noticed that my fuel tank was getting low. Truckers are given a route with designated fuel stops, and it's our responsibility to stop and fill up when we're running low. The company provides us with a fuel card, which basically pays for the fuel, so it's a pretty straightforward process. I found the next station on my route and pulled into the parking lot. I stopped the truck, got out, and began filling up. While I was waiting for the tank to fill, I decided to go inside the small convenience store attached to the gas station to stretch my legs and grab a quick snack. When I walked in, I was immediately struck by the silence. The lights were on, the shelves were stocked with goods, but there wasn't a single person in sight. No customers, no attendants, nothing. It was completely empty. At first, I thought maybe the person working the counter had stepped out for a minute or was on a break. I figured I'd just wait a moment and they'd show up. But as I looked around, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I called out just to see if anyone would respond, but there was no answer. It was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that just didn't feel normal, like the kind of silence you get in an empty room that you know should be full of activity. After waiting for a few minutes and still not seeing anyone, I figured I'd check outside. I thought maybe the attendant had stepped out for a smoke or something. So I walked out the back door of the store and started walking around the building to see if I could find anyone. That's when I turned the corner and saw something that still haunts me to this day. Standing by the side of the building were two men, and they were doing something to the gas station attendant. At first, I didn't know what I was seeing, but as I got closer, it became clear. The two men were wearing ragged clothing, their hair was unkempt and wild, and their eyes were wide, almost crazed. Their entire appearance screamed that something wasn't right. It was like they were completely out of place, and I felt an immediate sense of danger wash over me. The person who I assumed had been working inside the store was lying motionless on the ground. I couldn't tell if he was alive or dead, but the sight of him there, lifeless, sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing, and my instincts kicked in immediately. I screamed and turned to run back to my truck as fast as I could. My heart was racing, and I could barely think straight as I shoved the fuel nozzle back into place and scrambled into the cab of my semi. I started the truck and sped out of there without looking back, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I drove away, and I'll never forget what I saw. The two men were still standing there, calmly watching me drive off. They didn't chase me, didn't make any move to come after me. They just stood there, like nothing was unusual. It was as if nothing had happened. That image of them standing there, so still and silent, has stayed with me ever since. Once I was a safe distance away, I quickly called the local police department. I tried to explain everything as clearly as I could, giving them the location of the gas station and describing what I had witnessed. I also called my company to report the incident, hoping they could help in some way. But I still don't know if the police ever investigated the situation, and I've never heard anything back from them. I filed the report, but it felt like the whole thing was brushed aside. I couldn't get any answers, and I've been left with more questions than ever. The whole experience left me shaken. I still have no idea who those men were, or what they were doing to that attendant. Were they just two random criminals? Was it some kind of robbery gone wrong, or was there something more sinister happening there? Something darker than I could even begin to comprehend. They could have been part of a cult, or maybe even some kind of inbred family living out in the woods. It's hard to say, but I know one thing for sure: I don't want to find out. The thought of what might have been going on there is something I'd rather not dwell on. I'd rather not think about the alternative explanations for what I saw. Sometimes it's better not to know. It's been a few weeks since that night, but the images are still fresh in my mind. Every time I think back on it, I feel a knot in my stomach. I keep wondering what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer, if I had investigated a bit more. But I don't think I could have handled seeing more than I already did. I'm not sure I ever want to know the truth. Now, whenever I drive through Ohio or near any small, quiet gas stations in the middle of nowhere, I feel a sense of unease. It's like a shadow that follows me. I always check my surroundings more carefully, and I never assume things are as they seem. After all, you never know what kind of situation you could walk into, especially on the lonelier stretches of road. This experience has made me realize how little we really know about the world around us, especially when we're out on the road. As truckers, we see a lot of things, and we often hear strange stories, but there are some things that are just too bizarre to explain. For all I know, there are people out there living in ways that don't make sense to most of us, hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to stumble into their world. I don't know what happened at that gas station, and part of me is glad I don't. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, but it's something I'll never forget. And as long as I'm on the road, I'll always be wondering if I'll come across something like that again. Since that night, I haven't been able to shake off the feeling of unease. Every time I get behind the wheel and head out onto the open road, that image of the two men standing by the gas station staring at me is still there in the back of my mind. It haunts me in a way that I can't quite explain. I've been driving for 30 years now, and I've seen plenty of things that didn't sit right with me: strange people, odd situations, even dangerous encounters, but none of them ever felt like this. What happened in Ohio was different. It felt like I was caught up in something I didn't understand, something that was darker than anything I had ever imagined. In the days that followed, I tried to focus on my work, to get back into the rhythm of things. It wasn't easy. The thought of what I had seen kept creeping into my mind. I found myself avoiding certain gas stations and convenience stores, particularly the ones that were off the beaten path, the kind of places you only stop at when you're far from the main highways. I'd pull into those places and immediately I'd get that feeling, that sense that something wasn't quite right. I'd hurry in, grab what I needed, and leave as fast as I could. The memories were too fresh, and I wasn't ready to face whatever it was that I had stumbled upon. I mentioned the incident to a few of the other truckers I knew, We all travel the same routes, and we often cross paths at rest stops or fuel stations. I expected them to brush it off, maybe laugh at the idea of a ghostly encounter or tell me it was just some weirdos doing something shady, but what I got in return shocked me. Some of the guys had similar stories, odd encounters on long stretches of road, strange figures in the distance, and unexplained things happening at the places they stopped to fuel up or take a break. One of the drivers, an old-timer who had been on the road longer than I had, told me something that stuck with me. He said, "Tom, you've been out here long enough to know that there's more to this world than what we see. You've heard the stories, right? About the things that roam out there in the middle of nowhere. There's a lot of places out here where the veil between the world we know and something else is thin. Some folks never see it, but others do. And sometimes you just have to trust what your gut's telling you." That conversation left me with more questions than answers. What did he mean by the veil? Was he suggesting that there was some kind of supernatural element to all this? I've always been a practical guy. I'm not one to believe in ghosts or things like that, but after what I saw, I couldn't help but wonder. The whole experience felt so surreal, so out of place, that part of me started to question everything I thought I knew about the world. I didn't really talk to my wife about it. I didn't want to worry her, especially when I didn't have any concrete answers to give. I knew she'd be concerned, and honestly, I wasn't sure how to explain it. How do you tell someone you love that you saw something you can't explain? Something that shook you to your core? I figured I'd just keep it to myself, at least for now, but I could tell she noticed that something was off. I wasn't sleeping as well, and I seemed distracted, lost in thought a lot more than usual. She asked me a few times if everything was okay, and I'd just say I was tired from the long hours on the road. But the truth was, I wasn't just tired, I was unsettled, and the longer I tried to push the memory of that night out of my mind, the more it seemed to come back, stronger each time. I started to pay more attention to the little things around me when I was out on the road. The sounds of the truck, the shadows in the distance, the way the headlights illuminated the road ahead. I found myself driving a little more cautiously, always scanning the surroundings for anything out of place. Every time I passed a quiet gas station or a small convenience store, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd see something again. The thought of encountering those two men, or something worse, made my skin crawl. It was hard to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Whenever I stopped at a rest area, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, observing me from the shadows. I couldn't help it. That encounter had left a mark on me, and I didn't know how to get rid of it. I began to research the area around Ohio where the gas station was located. I wanted to know if there had been any reports of strange happenings in the region, or if others had seen similar things. But as I dug deeper, I found very little. No one had reported anything unusual at that gas station, and there were no stories of strange figures or unexplained events in the area. It was almost as if nothing had happened at all. It made me wonder, had I imagined the whole thing? Was it just a product of fatigue or my mind playing tricks on me after hours on the road? Or had I truly witnessed something unexplainable? I'm not sure I'll ever know the truth. I've come to accept that some things are just too strange to understand, and maybe it's better that way. Sometimes it's easier not to know what's out there, lurking in the dark corners of the world. Maybe some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and maybe it's safer to leave them that way. I still drive every day, still make my deliveries and follow my routes, but I'm more cautious now. I trust my instincts a little more, and I pay closer attention to my surroundings. I don't want to find myself in another situation like the one in Ohio, but I also know that being a trucker means being prepared for the unexpected. The road is a place of constant movement, and sometimes the things you encounter out there are not what they seem. Whether it's a strange figure in the distance or something more sinister, I'll keep driving, but I'll never forget that night. The image of those two men standing by the gas station, watching me leave, will stay with me forever. And every time I drive past a quiet, out-of-the-way stop, I can't help but wonder what might be waiting. As the weeks passed, I tried to push the incident further back in my mind. I told myself that life had to go on, and I couldn't let one strange encounter derail everything I had worked for. But even as I tried to focus on my work, the memories kept coming back in waves. I'd be driving down a familiar stretch of road, the steady hum of the truck filling the silence, and then suddenly, a thought would flash through my mind. I'd see the men again, their wild eyes, their ragged clothing, the way they stood there so still as I drove away. It was like I could never escape. One night, after finishing a particularly long stretch of driving, I pulled into a rest stop near a small town in Wyoming. I'd been on the road for over 12 hours, and I was beyond exhausted. The last thing I wanted was to relive the experience from Ohio, but the tiredness in my bones made it hard to focus on anything else. The rest area was quiet, and I was one of the few trucks parked along the edge of the lot. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the faint rustling of wind in the trees. I climbed out of the truck, stretching my legs as I walked toward the small building that housed the restrooms and vending machines. I wasn't in the mood for snacks, but I figured I could grab a drink to help me stay awake for the rest of the night. As I approached the building, something caught my eye. There, standing in the shadows just beyond the light, was a figure. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another trucker who had pulled in for the night. But as I looked closer, I saw that the figure wasn't moving. It was standing perfectly still, almost unnaturally still. A shiver ran down my spine, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The figure didn't look like a person at all. It was taller than any person I'd ever seen, with broad shoulders and long limbs. It didn't have the ragged clothing of the men I had encountered in Ohio, but something about it felt just as wrong. My heart began to race, and my instincts screamed at me to get back to the truck and drive away. But for some reason I couldn't move. I stood frozen, my eyes locked onto the figure, waiting for it to make a move. After what felt like an eternity, the figure finally shifted, stepping out of the shadows and into the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It was no person at all. The figure had a massive, hulking frame, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. It was covered in what looked like dark fur, and its face was hidden in shadow, but I could make out the glowing reflection of its eyes. They shone bright in the darkness, almost like they were watching me, studying me. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. Was this a hallucination, a trick of the light, or had I really just stumbled upon something out of a nightmare? I couldn't tell, but I knew one thing for sure: I didn't want to find out. My legs finally kicked into gear, and I ran back to my truck as fast as I could, jumping into the cab and slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps. I started the engine and tore out of the rest stop without a second thought, not even daring to look back. I didn't stop driving that night. I couldn't. The image of the creature, whatever it was, kept replaying in my mind. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The thought of stopping again, even at the next truck stop, filled me with dread. I just kept driving, hour after hour, as the night stretched on. Eventually, I found a place to pull over and rest, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, running over every detail of the encounter. Could it have been the same kind of creature I'd seen before in Ohio? Was I just imagining things again? Or was there something truly strange happening out there, something I couldn't comprehend? The rest of my trip was filled with a constant sense of unease. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, lurking in the shadows. I would glance over my shoulder every so often, half expecting to see those glowing eyes again, staring back at me from the darkness. It was as if the incident in Ohio had opened some kind of door, and now the strange, unexplainable things were following me wherever I went. Over the next few weeks, I started to hear more stories from fellow truckers about strange encounters. Some of them mentioned seeing figures in the distance or hearing strange noises late at night. One guy told me about a time when he swore he saw something big and hairy crossing the highway in front of him, only to have it disappear into the trees before he could react. Another driver talked about seeing strange lights hovering over the road late at night, lights that didn't look like any aircraft he'd ever seen. It seemed like these stories were becoming more common, and as I listened, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe there was something to all of it. Maybe it wasn't just fatigue or my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe there were things out there that we weren't meant to understand. I don't know what I saw that night in Ohio or at that rest stop in Wyoming. Was it a hallucination? Was it a creature from folklore, something ancient and unknown? Or was it just some kind of strange coincidence, a series of events that lined up in a way that made them seem more significant than they really were? I can't say for sure, but I do know this: the road is a strange place. As a trucker, you spend a lot of time alone, driving through remote areas, far from the safety of civilization. You see things that don't always make sense, and you hear stories from people who've been on the road even longer than you. Some of them are hard to believe, but after what I've experienced, I'm not so quick to dismiss them anymore. I keep driving day after day, doing the job I've always done, but I can't help but wonder what else is out there, hidden in the shadows. The open road can be a lonely place, but sometimes It feels like the loneliness is hiding something, and I can't help but think that no matter how many miles I drive, I might never truly be alone on this journey. In the mid-2000s, I worked as a full-time truck driver. It was a tough job, but it provided a steady income for my family, and that's what mattered most. The pay wasn't anything to brag about, it was average compared to what drivers in other states were making, but the benefits were a lifesaver. Health insurance, retirement plans, and paid time off were perks I wasn't willing to give up, especially with a growing family to support. These benefits made the long hours, the isolation, and the constant grind worth enduring. Still, trucking wasn't easy. The job required stamina, patience, and an ability to stay focused for hours on end. We were always on a tight schedule, driving from one destination to the next, with barely any time to rest. Company policy allowed us a 30-minute break, but only after driving for a solid 8 hours. It didn't leave much room for error or relaxation. The job wasn't as laid back as some people might think. It wasn't just a matter of sitting behind the wheel and enjoying the scenery. Every mile came with responsibilities, deadlines, and at times risk. One particular night stands out in my memory. I had just transported a load of goods to a factory. It was late, and the workers were unloading my truck while I rested in my sleeper berth. For those who don't know, the sleeper berth is a small, cramped space behind the driver's seat where truckers catch some shut-eye. It's far from luxurious, but it's essential for long hauls. That night, I was exhausted and looking forward to a few hours of rest before hitting the road again. As I lay there trying to drift off, I noticed movement outside my truck. A man was walking toward me. He looked to be in his mid-20 seconds, wore all black, and had an air of unease about him. His head darted back and forth as if he didn't want to be seen. My first thought was that he might be a worker from the factory, but something about him didn't seem right. When he reached my truck, he looked up and saw me through the window. To my surprise, he gave me a small wave, then motioned for me to come down. His gesture set off alarm bells in my head. The sleeper berth isn't easy to see from outside, so how did he know I was there? That small detail unnerved me. I climbed into the driver's seat, rolled down the window, and asked what he wanted. His response was odd. He started mumbling, stumbling over his words, and couldn't form a coherent sentence. I like your truck. Can I see it?" His tone was shaky and his request was strange. I didn't want to be rude, but I was also tired and irritated that he had interrupted my rest. I told him to leave me alone and let me sleep. He nodded and walked away, crossing the street until I could no longer see him. Even after he left, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling he gave me. He didn't look like someone who worked at the factory, and his behavior was suspicious. I tried to go back to sleep, but my mind wouldn't. Was he? Why had he approached my truck? And why had he acted so strangely? These questions swirled in my head, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. About an hour later, I was startled awake by a loud knock on the side door of my truck. When I opened my eyes, I saw 2 police officers standing outside. Their presence immediately put me on edge. What could they want? I rolled down the window and they introduced themselves. Then, without hesitation, they asked if I had seen a young man wandering around the area. At first, I was confused. I didn't know what they were talking about, but then I remembered the man in black who had approached my truck earlier. I described him to the best of my ability, his age, clothing, and the strange questions he had asked me. The officers thanked me for the information and went on their way, but I could tell something serious was going on. Later, I learned the chilling truth. The man had broken into a woman's car while she was still inside. He stole all her valuables and, according to what I heard, may have tried to harm her. My stomach turned when I thought about what could have happened if I had let him into my truck. Was he planning to rob me, steal my truck, hurt me? I'll never know for sure, but the thought haunts me to this day. That night changed the way I approached my job. I became much more cautious, especially when interacting with strangers. I made a point to park in well-lit areas whenever possible and avoided opening my door for anyone unless absolutely necessary. Trucking already came with its fair share of risks, bad weather, mechanical failures, and long hours on the road. The last thing I needed was to put myself in danger by being too trusting. Over the years, I've heard similar stories from other truckers. It seems like every driver has at least one tale of a strange or unsettling encounter on the road. Some are harmless, while others, like mine, serve as a sobering reminder of the dangers that come with the job. One fellow driver, a guy named Tom, once told me about a time when he stopped at a rest area late at night. As he was walking back to his truck, he noticed a group of people loitering near the parking lot. Something about them seemed off, so he kept his distance. Later, he found out they had been targeting truckers, robbing them while they slept. Another trucker, a woman named Sarah, shared a story about a man who had tried to climb onto her trailer while she was driving down the highway. She only realized what was happening when other drivers started honking and flashing their lights to get her attention. Thankfully, she managed to pull over and call the police before anything worse happened. Hearing these stories made me realize how important it is to stay vigilant. Trucking isn't just a job, it's a lifestyle that requires constant awareness and adaptability. The road can be a dangerous place, but it's also full of lessons. Every encounter, whether good or bad, teaches you something new. For me, that night at the factory was a wake-up call. It reminded me to trust my instincts and to always be prepared for the unexpected. While the road can be lonely, it's also unpredictable, and you never know what or who you might encounter. Even now, years later, I still think about that man in black. I wonder if he was ever caught, or if he's still out there, preying on unsuspecting people. The thought sends chills down my spine, but it also serves as a reminder to stay alert and protect myself. Trucking taught me many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this: safety always comes first. Even after years had passed, I couldn't help but think back to that eerie encounter at the factory. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't trusted my gut that night. Would the man in black have tried to overpower me, rob me, something worse? These are the kinds of questions that linger in the back of a trucker's mind, especially after an unsettling experience. That wasn't my only strange encounter during my trucking career. The road has a way of throwing unexpected surprises your way, some harmless, some downright chilling. One incident that still sticks with me happened a few months after the factory encounter. I was driving late at night, somewhere along a remote stretch of highway in the Midwest. The road was practically deserted, save for the occasional passing car or truck. The sky was clear, but it was so dark that I could barely see the horizon ahead. I remember feeling a deep sense of isolation, the kind that only comes when you're miles away from civilization. I was about 4 hours into my shift when I spotted something strange in the distance. At first, it looked like a pile of debris on the road, a tire, maybe, or some garbage that had fallen off a vehicle. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a person, a man, lying in the middle of the highway. I immediately slowed down and stopped a safe distance away. My heart was racing as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was he hurt, unconscious, dead? Or was this some kind of trap? My instincts told me to be cautious. I locked my doors and turned on my hazard lights, hoping another vehicle might come along soon. I grabbed my flashlight and considered stepping out of the truck, but something held me back. The scene didn't feel right. The man was lying too still, and the positioning of his body seemed deliberate, almost staged. I decided to stay inside and call for help. While I was on the phone with the dispatcher, something unexpected happened. The man suddenly sat up, looked directly at my truck, and then bolted into the darkness. I couldn't believe what I'd just witnessed. Who was he? Why was he lying in the middle of the road? Was he trying to lure me out of my truck for some reason? I'll never know. When the authorities arrived, I described what I'd seen, but by then, the man was long gone. That incident reinforced what I'd already learned: always trust your instincts. The road is unpredictable, and sometimes the best decision is to stay in your vehicle and wait for help. Over the years, I've exchanged plenty of stories with fellow truckers, and one thing is clear: everyone has experienced something strange or unsettling at some point. These tales serve as a reminder that life on the road isn't just about delivering goods, it's about navigating the unexpected, often alone and far from help. One story that stood out to me came from a driver named Pete. He was a veteran trucker who had seen it all, from severe storms to mechanical breakdowns in the middle of nowhere. But the story he shared with me wasn't about weather or trucks. It was about an encounter he had at a rest stop late one night. Pete had pulled over to get some sleep after a long day of driving. The rest stop was mostly empty, save for a couple of other trucks parked nearby. As he was settling into his sleeper berth, he heard a faint tapping on his driver's side window. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the tapping grew louder and more insistent. When he finally got up to check, he saw a woman standing outside his truck. She was dressed in casual clothes and looked like she might have been in her 30 seconds. She claimed her car had broken down and asked if he could give her a ride to the nearest town. Pete was immediately suspicious. He'd heard stories about setups like this, where a seemingly stranded person lures a trucker out of their vehicle, only for an accomplice to rob them, or worse. Pete told her he couldn't help and advised her to call for roadside assistance. She pleaded with him, but he held firm. Eventually, she walked away, disappearing into the shadows. The next morning, Pete heard from another trucker that a group of thieves had been targeting drivers at that rest stop, using a woman to gain their trust. Pete's decision to stay cautious might have saved him from a dangerous situation. Stories like Pete's, and my own experiences, have made me deeply respect the dangers of trucking. It's not just the long hours or the physical toll of driving, it's the unpredictability of human encounters. Truckers often operate in isolation, far from help, and that makes us vulnerable in ways most people don't think about. Despite the challenges, I wouldn't trade my time as a trucker for anything. The job taught me invaluable lessons about self-reliance, vigilance, and the importance of trusting my instincts. It also gave me a unique perspective on the world. I've seen parts of the country that many people only dream about, from breathtaking mountain ranges to quiet, open highways under a canopy of stars. For all the eerie encounters and tense moments, there were also plenty of good memories. I remember stopping at diners in small towns and striking up conversations with locals who were curious about my travels. I remember the camaraderie among truckers, the sense that we were all part of a shared experience, even if we didn't know each other personally. And of course, I remember the satisfaction of completing a long haul and knowing I'd done my job well. But if there's one takeaway from my years on the road, it's this: you can never be too careful. Whether it's a man in black at a factory, a stranger lying in the road, or a suspicious tap on your window, every encounter has the potential to turn dangerous. Always stay alert, trust your gut, and remember that your safety comes first. Even now, long after I've left the trucking life behind, those lessons stay with me. The road may be behind me, but its lessons are etched into my memory, a constant reminder of the unpredictable and often mysterious nature of life on the move. Many years ago, I worked as a truck driver in New Hampshire. My job involved delivering goods to different facilities all over the East Coast. The pay was good and it was enough to cover my bills and living expenses. However, the job itself was far from easy. Driving a massive truck for hours and hours every single day might sound relaxing or even peaceful to some people. But trust me, it's not as easy as it seems. The hours were long and you couldn't really stop whenever you wanted. We had strict policies about breaks. According to the rules, we were allowed a 30-minute break only after driving for 8 cumulative hours. Once that break was over, we were expected to get right back on the road and continue driving to the assigned destination. There wasn't much room for flexibility. The schedule was demanding, to say the least. Some weeks, I would be working as much as 70 hours. That kind of workload really pushes your limits. To keep myself awake and alert, I often had to rely on coffee, and lots of it. Sometimes it felt like I was drinking coffee just to survive. Being a truck driver meant spending a lot of time on the road, often alone. During those long hours, you'd occasionally encounter some unusual or downright strange situations. Over time, I got used to weird things happening now and then. But one experience I had during a trip through Pennsylvania still stands out as the most bizarre. At the time, I was on my way back to New Hampshire. I had been driving for about 2 hours when I decided to pull over and rest. I parked my truck behind a couple of other trailers at a quiet stop. It was nighttime, and I was exhausted. I climbed into the sleeping compartment of my truck and fell asleep quickly. I ended up sleeping for about 7 hours, which was exactly what I needed. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by a loud banging noise. It sounded like someone was hitting the right door of my truck. I checked the time, it was around 6 a.m. I was annoyed. Getting woken up like that is never fun, especially when you've been on the road for hours. My first thought was that one of the other truck drivers parked nearby was playing a prank on me or needed something. I climbed out of my sleeping compartment and went to the window, but when I looked outside, there was no one there. The area was completely empty. Confused, I sat back down, thinking maybe I had imagined it or that it was just the wind. But then, I heard the same loud banging again, this time on the left door of my truck. My heart started racing. I quickly turned to look out the left window, but once again there was no one there. All I could see was snow falling quietly in the early morning light. The silence outside was almost eerie. At that moment, I started to feel uneasy. Who or what was banging on my truck? It didn't make any sense. And then, out of nowhere, I heard the banging again. This time, it was coming from both doors at the same time. The sound was so loud and forceful that it shook my entire truck. Keep in mind, this wasn't a small vehicle. It was an 80,000-pound semi-truck, and whatever was causing the knocking had to be incredibly strong to make it shake like that. By this point, I was both scared and frustrated. I yelled out, telling whoever it was to stop messing with me, but the banging didn't stop. It kept going, and it was so loud that it felt like it was echoing inside my head. It wasn't just creepy anymore. It was becoming downright unbearable. I finally decided that enough was enough. I jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was going on. Just as I was preparing to leave, I noticed that the other two trucks parked near me had also started their engines. They began driving off, one after the other, as if they had experienced the same strange events that I did. Once I was back on the road, I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. It didn't make any sense. Later, I shared the story with some of my trucker friends. To my surprise, many of them had their own creepy encounters to share. From strange lights in the sky to mysterious figures appearing on the side of the road, it seemed like being a truck driver exposed you to all kinds of weird and unexplainable phenomena. Looking back, that experience in Pennsylvania still gives me chills. I have no idea what caused the knocking or why it was so intense. To this day, I wonder if it was just a prank, an animal, or something else entirely, something I don't even want to imagine. If there are any other truckers out there who have experienced something similar, or even something completely different, I encourage you to share your stories. Being on the road for long stretches of time can lead to some truly strange and unforgettable experiences. And sometimes it's good to know that you're not alone in encountering the unexplained. After the strange encounter in Pennsylvania, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out of the ordinary had happened. For the rest of the drive back to New Hampshire, I kept glancing in my mirrors, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But the road was quiet, with no signs of anything unusual. Still, the memory of the loud, forceful banging stayed fresh in my mind, making me uneasy. When I finally arrived at my destination, I parked the truck and took a moment to collect myself. One of the first things I did was call my friend Dan, a fellow trucker who had been driving even longer than I had. Dan was the kind of guy who'd seen it all on the road. If anyone could make sense of what I experienced, it would be him. I described the incident in detail, from the knocking on both doors to the way the truck shook. Dan listened quietly, then let out a long sigh. "You're not the first to tell me something like this," he said. "I've heard stories of weird stuff happening at rest stops and on deserted highways, especially in the middle of nowhere. Sometimes it's people playing pranks, but other times..." His voice trailed off. "Other times it's something we can't explain." Dan went on to share a few stories he had heard from other truckers. One of them involved a driver who saw a shadowy figure running alongside his truck at 60 miles per hour. Another told of a driver who woke up to find muddy handprints on his truck's windshield, even though he had parked in the middle of a dry desert. The more I listened, the more I realized how common these strange encounters were among people who spent their lives on the road. As the days passed, I found myself growing more curious about these unexplained events. I started asking other truckers about their experiences, and the stories they shared were enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Some mentioned seeing ghostly apparitions on quiet roads. Others talked about hearing voices calling their names when no one was around. A few even claimed to have seen UFOs hovering in the sky late at night. One story in particular stuck with me. A trucker named Mike told me about a time he was driving through the Appalachian Mountains late at night. He noticed a strange light in his rearview mirror, but when he looked closer, he realized it wasn't headlights. The light seemed to be floating above the ground and was moving faster than any car could. It followed him for miles before suddenly disappearing. "I don't know what it was," Mike said, his voice trembling slightly. "But whatever it wasn't from this world." Hearing these stories made me realize just how unpredictable life on the road could be. It wasn't just about delivering goods and meeting deadlines, it was also about navigating the unknown. Every trip felt like an adventure, and while most of the time it was routine, there were always those moments that reminded you how mysterious the world could be. Over time, I became more cautious during my drives. I made a habit of parking in well-lit areas whenever possible and avoiding isolated rest stops at night. But even with these precautions, I couldn't completely escape the strange occurrences. There was one time, for instance, when I was driving through rural Virginia. It was close to midnight, and I was on a narrow, winding road with no other vehicles in sight. Suddenly, my radio started picking up static, even though I hadn't touched it. Then a faint voice came through saying, "Turn around." I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The voice was soft but clear, and it sent chills down my spine. I looked around, but there was nothing but darkness. I didn't turn around, of course, but for the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. Despite these eerie encounters, I continued working as a truck driver for several more years. The job was tough, but it gave me a sense of freedom that I couldn't find anywhere else. There's something about being out on the open road, with nothing but your thoughts and the hum of the engine, that makes you feel alive. Even now, years after leaving the trucking industry, I still think about those strange moments. Were they just coincidences? Pranks? Or was there something more to them? I don't know if I'll ever have the answers, but one thing is certain. Life as a trucker is anything but ordinary. If you're a trucker or have spent time on the road, I'd love to hear your stories. Whether they're strange, funny, or just plain unbelievable, they're all part of what makes this lifestyle so unique. And if you're thinking about becoming a truck driver, just remember, expect the unexpected. The road has a way of surprising you, often when you least expect it. As time went on, I started to wonder if there was more to these strange experiences than just isolated incidents. I began talking to more experienced truckers, the kind of folks who had been on the road for decades and had seen it all. Their stories added another layer of intrigue to what I had already heard. One of the most unsettling tales came from a trucker named Ray. He was a grizzled old-timer, the kind of guy who seemed like nothing could faze him. Over coffee at a truck stop in Kentucky, he told me about a stretch of highway in the Midwest that was notorious among truckers. According to Ray, drivers who stopped there at night often reported seeing a woman standing by the side of the road. She wore a white dress and had long, dark hair that obscured her face. Some truckers claimed she would try to flag them down, and if they stopped, she would vanish the moment they opened their door. Ray said he had encountered her once himself. "It was around 2 a.m. and I was dead tired," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "I saw her standing there, right on the shoulder. At first, I thought she was a hitchhiker, but something about her didn't seem right. She didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, staring at the road. I didn't stop, just kept driving. When I glanced in my rearview mirror a few seconds later, she was gone." Hearing stories like that made me realize how many mysteries the road held. Some were explainable, optical illusions, fatigue, or the mind playing tricks, but others defied logic. For instance, a few truckers mentioned stretches of road where GPS devices would malfunction or strange, unmarked vehicles would appear and disappear without explanation. These stories weren't just campfire tales. They were real experiences that had left seasoned drivers scratching their head. One of the most common themes I noticed in these stories was the sense of isolation. Being alone in a massive truck, surrounded by miles of empty road, does something to your mind. It heightens your senses and makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement. That heightened awareness might explain some of the odd things people experienced. Or maybe the road really does have its own secrets. I'll admit, there were times when the isolation got to me too. Once, during a long haul through the Rockies, I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the truck. It was just a feeling at first, a sense that someone was sitting in the passenger seat, even though I knew it was empty. Then, I started hearing faint whispers, like someone was trying to speak but couldn't quite form the words. I turned off the radio, thinking it might be picking up interference, but the whispers continued. They were soft, almost gentle, but they sent chills down my spine. I ended up pulling over and taking a break, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I got back on the road, the feeling was gone, but the memory stayed with me. Over the years, I started to see these experiences as part of the job. They weren't just scary, they were a reminder of how vast and mysterious the world could be. Every trucker I talked to had at least one story like mine, and each one was unique. Some were terrifying, others were strange, and a few were downright unexplainable. One of the more positive stories came from a trucker named Lisa. She told me about a time when she was driving through a desert in Arizona. Her truck broke down in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. It was late at night and she didn't have cell service. Just as she was starting to panic, a man in an old pickup truck appeared out of nowhere. He offered to help, and within minutes, he had her truck running again. When she turned to thank him, he was gone. No headlights, no sound of a truck driving away, just silence. "I don't know who or what he was," Lisa said, "but I'll always be grateful." Stories like Lisa's made me wonder if there was something out there watching over truckers. Maybe the road wasn't just a place of mystery and danger. Maybe it was also a place where strange, unexplainable kindness could happen. Even though I've been off the road for years now, I still think about those days often. The experiences I had, the people I met, and the stories I heard are etched into my memory. Trucking taught me a lot about resilience, independence, and the beauty of the unknown. It also taught me to keep an open mind, because sometimes the world doesn't make sense, and that's okay. If you're reading this and you're a trucker, or if you've spent time on the road, I'd love to hear your stories. Whether they're strange, inspiring, or just plain weird, they're all part of the incredible tapestry of life on the highway. And if you're not a trucker but have ever wondered what it's like, I hope this gives you a glimpse into the unique, unpredictable, and sometimes eerie world of trucking. The road is a place of endless possibilities. You never know what you'll encounter, but one thing is certain: every mile holds a story.